My sister's bracelet shouldn't have been in my husband's study. That was the thought that stopped me cold on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. Standing in the doorway of a room I had every right to enter, holding a piece of jewelry I hadn't seen in 14 months. The silver bracelet with the small Pohutukawa flower charm, the one our mother had given Claire on her 40th birthday. The one Claire had worn every single day since. The one Claire had been wearing the last morning I ever saw her. I set it down on the desk and stepped back. My hands were shaking. Let me tell you how I got there. My name is Graham Alderton. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer in Christchurch. Built a decent life, raised 2 kids who turned out better than I deserved, and buried a wife I loved more than I ever told her. Patricia passed in 2018 from a brain aneurysm. No warning, no goodbye. Just a Tuesday morning and then a phone call that rearranged the rest of my life into a before and an after. My sister Claire is 57. She never married. She poured herself into her work environmental consulting, mostly around the Canterbury Plains and the Mackenzie Basin, and into her friendship with me. After Patricia died, it was Claire who showed up at the door with groceries. Claire who sat with me through the worst nights. Claire who told me, when I finally surfaced from grief, that I had to start living again. I met Diane in October 2020 at a fundraising dinner for the Christchurch Botanic Gardens. She was 52 then. Warm and elegant and thoughtful in a way that felt genuine. She worked in heritage restoration, or said she did. She laughed at things that were actually funny. She asked questions and listened to the answers. After 2 years of existing rather than living, she made me feel like a person again. We dated through that summer. She met Claire in March 2021. They were polite to each other, cordial. But Claire pulled me aside afterwards and said something I filed away. And then, to my lasting regret, there's something careful about her, Graham. Like she's performing rather than just being. I told her she was being protective. I told her it was natural after what we'd been through. Claire didn't push it. She was like that. She'd say her piece once, clearly, and then she'd respect your decision. We married in November 2021. Claire came to the wedding, smiled, hugged me hard at the end of the night and said she hoped she was wrong. She was not wrong. By January 2023, Claire had been missing for 14 months. She'd driven up to look at a wetland restoration project near Lake Tekapo on 3 November 2021, 2 days before our wedding, and hadn't come home. Her car was found on a gravel road off State Highway 8. Doors closed, keys on the seat, no sign of struggle. Her phone was dead. Her overnight bag was still in the boot. The police searched. Search and rescue covered the terrain around the lake for 10 days. Nothing. Detective Senior Constable Rawiri Parada, who handled the case out of Timaru, sat across from me in my kitchen in December 2021 and said the words no one ever wants to hear. Given the terrain and the time elapsed, Mr. Alderton, we have to consider the possibility that your sister may not be found. I never stopped looking. Not for a single week of those 14 months. I hired a private investigator in Christchurch who turned up nothing. I contacted DOC rangers. I drove up to the Tekapo area 4 separate times and walked those roads myself. Diane always came with me. She knew exactly where Claire was the entire time. The bracelet was sitting on the corner of Diane's desk when I went into her study to find a pen. We'd been having work done on the section, a new retaining wall along the back boundary, and the contractor needed a signature on a variation form. Diane was at what she called a client consultation in the city. I went looking for a pen in the study she kept locked when she wasn't home but had forgotten to lock that afternoon. I nearly missed it. It was partly underneath an open folder, just the silver chain and the Pohutukawa charm visible. I thought I'd imagined it. I picked it up and read the engraving on the back of the charm, the one our mother had paid extra for. C and M, always. Claire and Mum. always. My mother had died in 2019. There was no possibility this bracelet had passed through normal hands to end up in my wife's study in a folder of documents. No innocent explanation existed. I sat down in Diane's chair. I don't know how long I sat there. The contractor knocked on the back door twice. I didn't move. When I finally stood up, I didn't put the bracelet back. I slipped it into my shirt pocket. Then I looked at the folder it had been sitting on. It was a property file, not a heritage restoration project. A private title search for a residential property in Akaroa, registered in a name I didn't recognize, Diane Sherwood. My wife's surname was Forsyth. Diane Forsyth. That was the name I'd married. But the rates notice in the folder showed a property in Akaroa, owned by a Diane Sherwood since 2019. I closed the folder exactly as I'd found it. I went into the kitchen, told the contractor I'd email the signed form tomorrow, and waited until his truck had left the driveway. Then I rang my daughter. Meredith is 34. She works as a medical administrator in Dunedin. She's the practical one, gets it from Patricia, and she'd had reservations about Diane from the beginning that she'd kept mostly to herself out of respect for me. When I told her what I'd found, she went quiet for a long moment. Dad, don't go back into that study. Don't touch anything else. I'm calling you back in 10 minutes. She called back in 8. She'd found a private investigator in Christchurch, a woman named Bev Hartmann, who had a background in financial fraud investigations and had done some work with the New Zealand police on covert asset tracing. Meredith had already sent her a message. Bev Hartmann met me the following afternoon at a cafe on Oxford Terrace. She was in her mid-50s, compact and precise. The kind of person whose stillness made you feel like she was processing everything 3 moves ahead. She had a flat white and a notebook, and she let me talk for 20 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her pen. The property in Akaroa, in a different name. That's not unusual on its own. But combined with the bracelet and the locked study, that's a pattern. Has she ever controlled your access to financial information? I thought about it. She handles the household accounts. Said she was better at it, and I didn't argue. I know we have a joint account. I don't know everything that's in it. Does she have a separate account you're aware of? Not that she's mentioned. Bev wrote something down. Does she ever ask about your estate planning, your will, your assets, your superannuation? The question landed strangely. She suggested we update our wills about 6 months after we married. Said it was just good sense. Bev nodded slowly. I'll start with the property. Give me 4 days. I drove home and made dinner and sat across from Diane at the kitchen table while she told me about her day. A consultation in Ferrymead. A difficult client who kept changing the brief. She was warm and natural and interested in everything I said. I thought about Claire's bracelet in the drawer of my bedside table, wrapped in a handkerchief. I didn't sleep. Bev called me on the 4th day. She didn't waste time. The Akaroa property is registered to Diane Sherwood, but it was purchased using funds traced to 2 prior estates. I've found 2 previous marriages. The first was to a man named Colin Sherwood. In Nelson, married 2009, passed away 2011. Cardiac arrest. He was 68. She inherited his property and most of his savings, approximately $340,000. The second was to a man named Terence Gallagher in Queenstown, married 2014, passed away 2016. Also cardiac, also ruled natural causes. He was 71. She inherited just over $620,000. I was gripping the phone hard enough that my knuckles ached. Graham, your wife is not Diane Forsyth. That identity was created in 2018. Her real name is Diane Sherwood, née Renata. She's been operating under constructed identities since at least 2008. I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment I found the bracelet. What does this have to do with my sister? There was a brief silence. That's what I'm still working on. But I found something this morning. A storage unit in Rolleston leased under the name Diane Forsyth. And I found a financial connection between your wife and your former business partner. A man named Warren Fitch. The floor moved beneath me. Warren Fitch had been my business partner for 11 years at Alderton and Fitch Structural Engineering. We'd built the practice together from nothing. In 2019, 7 months after Patricia died, I discovered a discrepancy in our billing records. Substantial fees charged to clients for work that hadn't been done. I'd confronted Warren. He'd admitted it, told me he'd had problems, asked for time to repay. I'd absorbed the loss and never reported it formally because Warren had a family and I was too gutted to fight anyone. Warren had known everything about my finances, my property, my income, my grief. How much? I asked. A transfer of $45,000 from Warren Fitch to an account linked to the Sherwood identity, dated September 2020. 1 month before you met Diane at the Botanic Gardens fundraiser. She hadn't found me by chance. She'd been sent to find me. Bev told me to go home, act normally, not to change a single thing. She was contacting a colleague she trusted at the Serious Fraud Office and wanted 24 hours before we involved formal authorities. Can you do that? She asked. I told her I could. I wasn't sure it was true until I was actually sitting across from Diane again that night, watching her pour the wine, listening to her talk about a documentary she'd been watching. Somewhere in that house was evidence of what she'd done to 2 men before me and possibly to my sister. I nodded and asked the right questions and said goodnight and lay awake until 3 in the morning. On the second night, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. The herbal tea. Every evening, without exception, Diane made me a cup of what she called her own blend, something she'd picked up from a health food supplier in Littleton. She said, it helped with sleep. I'd been taking it for well over a year. Somewhere in the past 8 months, I'd started having trouble with my concentration. I'd been misplacing things. I'd had 2 incidents at work, an error in a load calculation that a colleague caught, a meeting I'd forgotten entirely. I'd put it down to age, to grief catching up with me. I poured the tea into the garden through the laundry window and rinsed the cup. Within 2 days, I felt sharper than I had in months. I brought the tea to Bev. The results came back 6 days later. The blend contained kava at 5 times the normal recommended concentration, along with valerian extract at a dose she said would cause significant cognitive impairment in an older adult over sustained use. Not dangerous on its own, Bev said. Dangerous in what it was designed to do. Make me slow, forgetful, increasingly dependent, increasingly manageable. She'd also found the will. Diane had taken me to a solicitor in Papua Nui 18 months into our marriage to update my estate documents. I remembered the appointment. I remembered signing. What I didn't remember because I'd trusted her entirely was reviewing the final document myself. The will on file at the solicitor's office named Diane Forsyth as sole beneficiary of my estate, including my property in Merivale, my share of the engineering practice, and my superannuation. My children, Meredith, and my son, Daniel, who lives in Auckland, received token amounts. It was not the will I'd intended to sign. My estate was worth approximately $2.4 million. Bev sat across from me in her office with the documents spread between us and spoke carefully. She would have continued the cognitive impairment. At some point, probably within the next 12 to 18 months, you would have shown signs significant enough to involve a doctor. She already has a name in mind, a GP in Rangiora who I'm now investigating. If he diagnosed early onset dementia, she could pursue welfare guardianship, full legal control of your assets. After that, the timeline becomes, she paused, shorter. I thought of Colin Sherwood in Nelson, of Terence Gallagher in Queenstown. Both ruled natural causes. both gone within 2 to 3 years of marrying her. And Claire? I asked. Bev opened a second folder. She'd obtained CCTV footage from a service station on State Highway 8, dated 3 November 2021, the day Claire disappeared. My wife's car, a silver Subaru she'd traded in the following April, appeared on the footage heading north toward Tekapo at 2:47 inches the afternoon. Claire's car had been found at 6:15 that evening. She'd been there. I couldn't speak for a while. Bev didn't push me. Claire had been suspicious of Diane from the beginning. She'd told me so. Once. Quietly. And she'd been an environmental consultant who spent her working life documenting land and water resources, which meant she knew how to find things, verify things, follow paper trails. Had she been doing that? Had she been looking into Diane's background and gotten close enough to become a problem? There's something else, Bev said. She slid a document across the desk. It was a text conversation, recovered from a phone registered to Warren Fitch. Diane. Is she still asking questions? Warren. She rang me twice this week. Wants to know about the transfer. Diane. When is she next up at the project site? Warren. She mentioned Tekapo, first week of November. Diane. Good. Leave it with me. The texts were dated the 28th of October, 2021. 6 days before our wedding. 6 days before Claire drove up to the lake and never came home. Warren Fitch had known. He told Diane when and where my sister would be alone. Bev had already been in contact with the Serious Fraud Office and had forwarded the material to Detective Senior Constable Parada in Timaru, who had reopened Claire's case. The Akaroa storage unit had been obtained under a search warrant that morning. I didn't know yet what they'd found there. Bev told me I would know soon. She told me I needed to decide how to proceed. The SFO and police were coordinating. They wanted recordings, a confession, or at minimum, an incriminating conversation captured in a way that would hold. They wanted to move. Before Diane realized the investigation was active, I told them I'd do it. For the next 10 days, I wore a recording device, the size of a shirt button. I continued having dinner with my wife. I continued asking about her day. I stopped drinking the tea, replaced it with water in the same cup. Told her it tasted wonderful. I watched her face when I stumbled over words deliberately, when I pretended to forget a conversation we'd had the previous day. I watched the satisfaction she couldn't fully hide. On the 12th day, Warren came to the house. I hadn't seen him in 4 years. He looked smaller than I remembered. He sat at my kitchen table while Diane made coffee and wouldn't meet my eyes. They had documents for me to sign. A variation on the existing will, Diane explained gently. Just a clarification around the superannuation trustees. Very straightforward. The solicitor had sent it through. She placed the papers in front of me. I looked at them slowly. I turned them over. I asked Diane to explain it again. She did, warmly and patiently, her hand on my arm. Then she turned to Warren and said something that the recording captured in full. The doctor's appointment is confirmed for the 14th. If the assessment goes the way it should, we can file for welfare guardianship within 6 weeks. After that, she glanced at me. It gets much simpler, Warren said. And the Akaroa house? Diane said. Transferred. Once guardianship is in place. Before the end of the year. Warren looked at me at the version of me he thought he was seeing, and something crossed his face that might have been guilt. And Meredith and Daniel? Diane's voice cooled just slightly. They'll be fine. There'll be enough. There wouldn't have been. But we never got that far. I stood up from the table. Not slowly. Not with any pretense of confusion. I stood up straight and looked at both of them and said, I heard every word. The back door opened. Detective Senior Constable Parada came in, followed by 2 officers from the Serious Fraud Office and a constable I didn't know. Bev Hartmann came in behind them. Diane went completely still. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of cold recalibration, like a person who has just been told the rules of a game have changed and is already calculating the next move. Diane Sherwood, Detective Parada said. Also known as Diane Forsyth, also known as Renata Diane Hewitt. You're being arrested on charges of fraud, willful deception, administering a substance with intent to harm, and, as a person of interest in the disappearance of Claire Alderton, you do not have to say anything. But anything you do say may be given in evidence. Diane looked at me one more time. Her face had gone perfectly composed. You have no idea, she said quietly. How much work went into this? I know exactly how much work went into it, I said. That's why you're in handcuffs. They took her out. Warren didn't resist. He sat at the table with his hands flat on the wood and let the officers lead him out like a man who had already decided his part was done. The room was very quiet afterwards. Meredith was waiting in the hallway. She'd driven up from Dunedin that morning, and I hadn't known until she appeared in the doorway after the police took Diane out. She walked across the kitchen and put her arms around me without saying anything. I held on to her for a long time. 2 weeks later, a search team working from coordinates identified in materials recovered from the Akaroa storage unit found Claire. She was alive. She had been held in a converted outbuilding on a lifestyle block in the Mackenzie Basin, a property leased through a shell arrangement connected to the Sherwood identity. She had been there for 14 months. She was severely malnourished and had a knee injury that hadn't healed properly. But she was coherent. She was fierce. The first thing she said to the officers who opened the door was, "What took you so long?" I drove up to Christchurch Hospital the evening they brought her in. Meredith was already there. Daniel had flown in from Auckland. We stood around Claire's bed in a room that smelled of antiseptic and winter. And I held my sister's hand and could not find words for a very long time. I was looking into her, Claire told me when she could talk. After the wedding, I went back through everything I could find on Diane Forsyth, and I couldn't find anything that predated 2018. No records, no clients, no professional registration. I started pulling on threads. Warren rang me a few weeks into it, said I was wasting my time, that Diane was legitimate, which told me she wasn't. She looked at me steadily. I should have told you directly, instead of trying to build a full case first. I should have listened the first time you said something, I said. She squeezed my hand. We're both stubborn. It's a family trait. The court process took 18 months. Diane Sherwood, her legal name, pleaded not guilty to all charges and then, 3 weeks before trial, changed her plea on the fraud and administration charges in exchange for a full statement about the Colin Sherwood and Terence Gallagher cases. The New Zealand police coordinated with Nelson and Queenstown detectives. Both prior deaths were reopened. Tissue samples held from the original autopsies were retested. Both men had elevated levels of cardiac glycosides in their systems, consistent with prolonged low-dose administration of plant-based toxins. The judge at sentencing noted that Diane Sherwood had, over a period of at least 15 years, constructed false identities, targeted vulnerable widowers, and systematically dismantled their health, their autonomy, and ultimately, their lives. She was sentenced to 18 years without parole on the fraud and administration charges. The charges relating to Colin Sherwood and Terence Gallagher were filed separately in the Nelson and Queenstown courts. She would not be out in my lifetime, nor in Claire's. Warren Fitch was sentenced to 7 years for fraud, conspiracy, and willful concealment of information material to a missing persons investigation. His family did not attend the sentencing. His wife had left him 3 months after his arrest. At Warren's sentencing, he asked to address the court. He said he had introduced Diane to me, because he owed her money from a previous arrangement, an arrangement he didn't fully understand until it was too late. He said he had convinced himself that no real harm would come to me, that it was only about money, and that he had found it easier to believe that than to face what he was actually helping to do. He said he was sorry. I looked at him across the courtroom and thought about the 11 years we'd worked side by side. About the time his youngest daughter was ill and I'd covered his project load without being asked. About Patricia's funeral, where he'd stood at the back and cried. He hadn't been performing then. The friendship had been real, and he'd traded it for $45,000 and the easier path of looking away. I didn't speak to him. Claire spent 6 months in rehabilitation. Her knee required surgery. Her consultant said the recovery would be slow but complete. She moved into the spare room at my house in Maryvale for the first 3 months, and we ate breakfast together every morning and drove each other slightly mad, and it was the best period of my life since before Patricia died. In the evenings, we sat on the back deck with a cup of actual tea and talked about Mum, about Patricia, about the years between Claire's disappearance and her being found. Claire told me about the outbuilding, the mattress, the small window that faced south, the way she marked time by the sound of weather on the iron roof. She was matter-of-fact about it. She'd developed a system, she said. She'd kept her mind active. She'd refused, on principle, to stop believing someone would come. "I knew you'd find me," she said one evening. "I wasn't sure how long it would take, but I knew." "I almost didn't," I said. "But you did," she said. "That's the part that counts." 8 months after the sentencing, Claire and Meredith and I established the Alderton Sisters Foundation, named for our mother, Margaret Alderton, and intended to support people navigating financial and psychological abuse within intimate relationships. We fund free legal consultations for people who can't access independent legal advice when a partner controls their finances. We fund independent psychological assessments for older adults whose capacity is being questioned by a spouse or family member. We work with Bev Hartmann's network of investigators on cases involving suspected coercive control. In the first year, we received over 200 contacts. Financial abuse among people over 60 was, Bev told us, almost entirely underreported. Most people don't recognize it while it's happening. And most people, when they do recognize it, feel too ashamed to say so. That's the part I want to say plainly, because it took me a long time to say it to myself. I was 61 years old, educated, experienced, and deeply in love with a woman who was systematically poisoning me and planning my death. I hadn't been naive or foolish in any way that was unique to me. I'd been grieving and lonely and human, and she had been very, very practiced. The shame isn't mine to carry. It never was. I still have Claire's bracelet. It lives on the kitchen windowsill where I can see it every morning. The Pohutukawa charm catches the light in a particular way in late afternoon when the sun comes around the north side of the house. Last spring, Claire came for a long weekend and we drove down to Akaroa, not to the property, nowhere near it, but to the waterfront, where we ate fish and chips on a bench and watched the harbor go silver in the evening. Claire had her bracelet back on her wrist where it belonged. She rolled up her sleeve to show me that she'd had the engraving redone, because the original had worn thin. C and M. Always. Same as before. If you're reading this and something doesn't feel right in your relationship, if you find yourself forgetting things more than you should, if your finances feel out of your control, if the people you trusted before you met your partner have slowly become harder to reach, pay attention to that feeling. The people who mean you harm are not strangers in dark places. They are warm and funny and interested in everything you say. They make you feel, after loss and grief and loneliness, that you have finally come home. That is exactly why you must trust your instincts and verify what you're told. Claire says the most dangerous moment is the one just before you think to ask the question. Because that's the moment they're counting on. She's right. She usually is.